there are a number of people on the Zoom who I know are interested in Star Trek, so in the early Star Trek conventions. We did have some early Star Trek history with Berman and Langsam, but can you tell us some of the things or more interesting items that may have happened at the Star Trek conventions?
Well, I could, but then I'd have to gag you. It was really, well, I see Stu and Ben on the call, and if they can jump in and, you know, sort of help me refresh my memory. It really started as a continuation of a small group that Deborah and Elise put together at a library, I think in New Jersey, that they put up a notice and they got maybe 15, 20 people. And then after attending a Lunacon or two, and I would say, you know, sort of looked down upon because we weren't pure written word published science fiction. You know, we sort of had second-class citizenship. So a group of us got together and we said, well, let's put on our own convention. I'm sure there's a lot of Star Trek fans that don't know about Lunarians or other clubs. So we started using the Lunacon model as the basis for doing it with, you know, programming, a dealer's room, an art show. And we sort of publicized it a little bit because otherwise nobody would know about it. We rented out space, I think, for about 300 or 400 in the Statler Hilton, which, rest its soul, is being demolished as we speak. And I think we had about 3,000 people show up. Ben, Stu, was that? Yeah. And the fire marshal eventually came and had to close us down for overcrowding. So we became a little bit more formal. We incorporated as a Tellurian Enterprises, and we just started doing what people would tell us they would like to see at a Star Trek convention as opposed to a science fiction. It was also a different genre. Remember, this was visual media. TV was coming into its own. It was the golden age of TV. You had the world situation was ripe for Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future with Vietnam and the civil rights movement in reality in the world. And each year it started growing and we got more people. We had to rent out larger space. I think the final year we had, what, about 15,000, 20,000 people in, I forget which hotel it was, but it was, we used the Commodore. We get some of the stars from California, we contract to bring them in. And that was a big draw for the fans. And it was a whole different demographic. It was a lot of younger people who I think really were looking for their place in the world. And Star Trek, and especially the conventions, they realized they weren't alone in the universe. And so word of mouth.
With all of those performers, we were just talking about fannish performances. Did you guys have any made up performances at any of the Star Trek?
I think there were, I don't think we had any. We had a costume.
Yes. The last year we did Trek a Star.
Ah, thanks, Ben.
And actually there, as part of getting it done for cheap, we had spoken to a New Jersey-based Gilbert and Sullivan semi-pro group. And
high school group. I thought it was a high school group that
yeah, right. And basically the deal we cut was in exchange for them doing the final dress rehearsal as a public performance in their town, the town paid for their buses with all the performers.
That's really brilliant.
Minimal sets to come up to New York.
Love your backdrop, Ben, by the way. XB-70 is one of my favorite planes.
It's the Air Force Museum at Wright Pat.
I figured, yeah. I want to say about Star Trek fandom, 2 things or 3 things. First of all, you know, the old fandom was just afraid of being flooded by this huge mass of undifferentiated.
And we did a good job too.
Yes, so that's number one. Number two, as
Infusion of
Andy's
what we call
trying to
gen
interrupt me
fans
and
at the time.
say, yes, it did bring in a lot of young women, which was great, and help improve the gender balance in fandom as a whole. The third thing was that I don't think conventional, traditional fandom really understood that a significant fraction, I don't know about a majority, but a significant fraction of the people who were Star Trek fans attending these conventions were actually people who've been reading science fiction all along and just hadn't had a way to express that before. They didn't know about regular fandom, and Star Trek fandom, was brought to their attention. And a lot of those people hung around and became just regular members of fandom. And I think the prejudice against them did fade away fairly quickly as we began to realize those things.
Well, it
And,
took a while for the prejudice to disappear, Moshe.
What?
It took quite a while for the prejudice to disappear.
Oh, I'm sure there's some people who are still prejudiced against it. I can only speak for myself.
But don't forget that it was B.J. Trimble, really one of the major science fiction fans starting in the 50s.
Yep.
Yes.
Who launched so much to do with Star Trek.
And there was also a generation gap. Remember that a lot of the people who attended the traditional science fiction conventions were older folks who had been reading for a very long time. We were getting a lot of the younger people who were feeling the alienation of the time, both because they were young, they were the nerds of their school and what have you, and they felt very much alone. And this was the big kumbaya that was just waiting to happen, and it did after Roddenberry wrote the script and produced his initial shows.
Yeah, the 70s.
There was also very much the Star Trek conventions were programmed very much as a mixture of science fiction conventions and Star Trek elements, so that you would have a speech by Hal Clement followed by a speech by Leonard Nimoy in the same ballroom. It also meant that since people were afraid to give up their seats if they had good seats, it meant that a lot of people would say, oh, we've got this Star Trek panel, and then we've got this science fiction panel, and then another Star Trek. Well, we'll go listen to this science fiction panel because we're not going to give up our seats in the front 20 rows.
And it was also, the programming had to become much more formal because of the size of the crowds. It wasn't that you had an author sitting on the edge of a stage reading excerpts from his novel. Security and organization became a huge factor in running the conventions. And one year we had people who actually counterfeited our badges, and they were selling them on the street. So the following year, instead of the badge being the entry point, it was the badge holder, the color of the badge holder. So all those people who counterfeited the colored badges that we came up with were out of luck, and we saw that as a minor victory.
And that's something that's been continued since then at the Worldcon and other large conventions. And really the 70s, not just in New York, but nationally, was really the beginning of fandom's coming out party, where the general public became much more aware of conventions and the existence of the fan community. And that only grew and grew as the general acceptance of SF with Star Wars and Star Trek combined really began to have an international impact, and it just became normalized. Jerry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I have a question for Steve, but why don't you finish your thought first?
I just wanted to say that when I was a kid in elementary school, if I talked about starships or something like that, people didn't even know what it meant. And after Star Trek, everybody knew what a starship was. Everybody knew about faster than light travel and so on. It really changed the whole sociological background that from which fandom arose, and it started to become something very different from the minority community that we started out in.
Well, it got so popular that even Playboy got involved in trying, even though it was a bit of a fiasco, to have their own science fiction convention.
Yeah.
Near New York.
If you're talking about Bunnycon, that was a group. I didn't think that they were directly connected with Playboy. I thought that they were just using the Playboy resort because they had attempted to do
Yeah,
an
I believe-
SFExpo, which
SFExpo.
failed. And they lost a
You
lot of
had-
money, and then they held a second convention to try to make up for all that, and then they lost
I
more money.
believe
at that
you're
point.
right.
We can talk about that later, though. That's another thing.
You
that went
actually
on.
had the editor of Hustler magazine, what was his name, Larry Flint,
Yes.
try
Yeah.
to publish a serious science fiction magazine called Omni,
No,
which lasted a
That
few
wasn't
No.
Larry Flint. No,
It was Bob Guccione.
Right.
And it wasn't called, it was originally
Called
called Nova.
Nova.
And PBS had a copyright on the, they had a trademark on Nova for the science program. And that's why there's the first issue is Nova, and I have a dummy of it. And then it became Omni.
Well, I actually got involved in the trial with that because Elise and I, we were married at the time. We ran a business called Nova. And we had to go down and give depositions about the separation between the two. And one was really not connected to the other.
Yeah, but Bunnycon happened because the attorney, basically when SFExpo folded, but still had kept all the money, the Attorney General in New York said, you had better give these people a convention. So it was essentially a get out of jail free convention, which they held at the Playboy Resort because it was inconvenient enough that they thought that since SFExpo was planning on many, many thousands of people, and they knew they couldn't handle many thousands of people in New York, they said, well, we'll put it out in the middle of nowhere. New Yorkers don't drive, they won't be able to get there. And so it'll hold the numbers down to something they could afford to run the convention with.
Did that work?
Yes. But it also meant that, for example, SFExpo had already paid for a lot of people to come to the city so that, for example, since that they had already paid, it meant that, for example, Bert Chandler showed up at MidwestCon because
Right.
they'd already
Yes,
paid.
yes.
I was at that MidwestCon, yeah.
Yeah, they'd already paid for his plane ticket from Australia. So as long as he was going to be here, then, okay, Cincinnati, New York, same difference.
We did, Susan and I attended because we were helping our friend Jeannie DeMonica, who was in charge of the art show, as I recall. But Ben can correct me if it wasn't Jeannie. He's not saying anything, so I
I
must be right.
believe it
I
was.
wanted to say about a previous thing, these derogatory things about fans. When I went to Milford Prep School in 62 to 64, they called me Spaceman, thinking it was an insult, and I didn't tell them that I really appreciated the nickname.
So
Well-
the Lunacon, the year before Bunnycon was the Lunacon where SFExpo, I understand, was trying to promote itself. And a lot of things happened at that Lunacon that were quite out of the ordinary.
Very much so, including the only time that I can remember a convention being tear gassed deliberately as opposed to Baycon.
Yes, someone set off some device
wasn't
during a
tear gas.
movie showing, I think.
It was during the capture when Yang and Phil Folio had turned the capture into a slideshow, and they were doing performances around the country hoping to get a Hugo nomination out of the deal. And the rumor, and it is still very much a rumor, is that one of the people who had lost the security contract for SFExpo to the Dorsai, because the Dorsai ended up getting that security contract, decided that as long as Yang was there, they would go prove that they were a better security company than that one.
And let us refresh all our memories. Yang was Bob Aspirin.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and he was called Yang the Nauseating in his character as a member of the Dorsai, which was a
Dorsai irregulars.
yes, who derived that name from a Gordon Dixon novel.
Actually, a series.
It was what?
It was a series.
It's a
of novels.
series of stories.
Oh, okay.
including novels.
All right.
The-
And then another thing that happened was that Ted White was pied during
That was
that
in
convention.
76. That was in 76.
Wasn't it the same year?
No.
No.
Ted was guest of honor in 76 because it was the 50th anniversary of Amazing Stories. And, he was, representing the magazine, although there were other editors there as well, they brought in for the con. But so he was the target of the pie incident in 76. And I think they caught the guy, I believe.
Yes, we did.
And there's my memory is Ben says it was the same year.
No, it wasn't the same year. It wasn't in 74. It was in 76. I'm pretty sure.
Actually,
Could have
the
been two different
person
years.
who caught the guy, I believe, was John Boardman. He ran down the stairs to get to him from whatever floor we were on.
The 18th.
I can't
And
quite
I
picture John doing that, but
No.
Neither can I, but he was there before I got there.
I think it was.
And another thing that I recall happening now, again, this is my memory, is that this was all at the same convention, even if it wasn't. I just remember it all being on this one Lunacon, was that somebody was setting off cherry bombs in the bathrooms. And I had suspected that it was one of Anna Vargo's siblings. That might not be right. And also that the SFExpo paid for a large quantity of beer for a party that they wanted to have, but it was delivered to the wrong room, and it was a room full of teenagers who they drank all the beer and kind of wrecked mayhem on the room. But again, this is memories that I tend to improve stories by misremembering them.
Well, we can't talk about New York fandom without mentioning Comic-Con and Phil
Oh yeah,
Seymour,
yeah.
Which
Well, talk about
before
Comic-Con.
before
Go ahead and
Phil
start.
Seymour, I was involved and I did the program book for the 1964 Dave Keller's Comic-Con at the Broadway Central Hotel, which is it's a big character in Sister Carrie, and eventually literally fell down and collapsed. And then I worked on a convention, a comics convention in 65 with Ted White and John Benson and a bunch of others. And here's the program I ran off on my Ditto machine for the 66.
Yeah, it's
Can't,
really.
But
There's
can't
not
say enough of it, Andy.
these were before Phil Sewing. Science fiction fans involved were doing comics cons, and Phil Sewing came along later and made it much more commercial.
No, I think that was out of Malin.
What? No.
Was it all in the 70s? That I was gonna ask
Was
Steve
still
earlier was
running
when did the
Comic book shop
commercial-
Well, here, 68. This is the first one that Phil Sewing, I think, was involved in.
Right.
This is 68.
Okay.
And then it became nascent for a while, and then Adam Malin took it commercial, and
Well, that was later.
yeah.
Does anybody know if the people in San Diego were inspired by Phil Sewing?
No,
I think there was a bit of contention between Malin and
No,
Sewing.
that was the Golden State Comic Convention. Here's the program book.
This is
This
There's
is
a new
what
book
became-
about
this is
the
what became
Comic-Con.
Comic-Con.
ah,
This was in San Diego in the late 60s. And
Greg Bear
yeah,
was
here,
one of the founders of the San Diego Comic Con.
1970.
So in 1970, they were doing it out there, and Phil Searing was not involved in that.
No,
No, I'm not saying he was involved. I'm just asking whether, their awareness of his success with it in New York might have had some influence on them, or whether they just came up with it completely independently, which is also
no,
possible.
I think they took from Comic-Con, and they saw the same monetary potential of a
Yeah.
Comic-Con in the same way that a number of the Star Trek conventions, culminating with the one on just at the Javits Center a couple of years ago, saw the potential for monetizing. And that's, I think, really where Star Trek and a lot of the visual and media conventions have really gotten their start, was because they saw that there was potential for
Is that Heidi Saha
Heidi Saha.
on the cover of the?
Yes, no, this is art. This is not Heidi. This is artwork.
Yes, it's artwork, but
Yeah.
well, never mind.
No, it's a
There is a
character.
new book.
Vampirella.
Emperella.
There is a new
Well, didn't she do a
book,
custom
an oral
made?
history of
Yeah.
the San Diego Comic-Con has just come out, and Greg Bear is one of the contributors. And I don't think that it was intended to be a commercial convention at the beginning. I think it was a bunch of fans like Greg who started.
This was something else. Creation was, I think that was Adam Mellon.
Yeah.
Creation was a commercial, was the first big commercial convention, if I recall correctly.
Just to get off the comic thing for a minute, I wanted to mention one of the other things about New York fandom in the 70s was that we pretty much all of us attended the same round of East Coast conventions that we had up and down the East Coast. So, Boston, New York, Baltimore, Washington was something we just took for granted. And then when we could, a lot of us would drive out to Pittsburgh for Flange, or we would, in some years, we went out to MidwestCon in little caravans, which also were great bonding experiences, I think. And that's something that, I haven't done in ages, but
Ted White was going to MidwestCons. Initially, don't forget that in the 60s, you had WesternCon, you had MidwestCon. Disclave was done initially and then died, and then the first new Disclave was back in the 60s. Balticon started, I think, 67. Bosco and also started in 67 or 68. So a whole bunch of us would go out, drive out to MidwestCon. And also what happened was, for instance, when we were bidding for Nikon 3, we drove to MidwestCon, and then WesternCon was the week later. So we actually, a bunch of us drove out from Cincinnati.
it was always my ambition to do that. I never did it.
And it was grueling. It was really grueling.
I'm sure it was, but just
we went in Ted
the
White's
idea of 2
White's
weeks in a row.
unair-conditioned Greenbrier through the humid desert during the daytime because we did not know.
Yeah. No, I just like the idea of 2 weeks of conventions in a row with the time in between spent completely with other fans. And I thought that was going to be, a really memorable thing to do. But just driving out to MidwestCon was a substantial trip and coming back, of course. But I always felt it was worth it. I enjoyed every one of those that I went to. And I think I forgot to mention PhilCon in the list of East Coast cons.
Yeah.
It was, so there were many
Thank you,
fewer
Faye.
cons. Many fewer cons.
My first PhilCon in 1964, there were 5 of us in a room. It was I think it was the Robert Morris. It was some hotel which later became a Bible study college, I swear. And there were 5 of us in the room, and it was Ted White and Dave Van Arnhem and Mike McInerney and Rich Brown and me in one room. It was a $10 room. And we took the mattresses off the bed.
Off the box springs, yeah.
And Mike McInerney slept in the bathtub.
Of course. What else? Those techniques were imitated many times over the years.
Many times.
By most
They had
of us.
precedents. They had precedents as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to circle back to something way earlier because I wanted to mention that the fanzine epicenter of New York seemed to be Brooklyn. That was where Ernie and Joyce Katz had their apartment and used to have.
Arnie was my roommate from 1968 to 1970 in the same apartment I am still in today. Shocking, but true. My rent is about, I don't know, 12 or 13 times what it was back then, but it's still a quarter of the going rate for an apartment in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, Andy is talking about real estate. I actually brought it up because I wanted to mention that the circle of fans who hung out with Arnie and Joyce, that included many people.
Chris,
Bill
Yes.
Kunkel,
Barry,
and Lenny
Bill
Bayless.
There we go. Lenny, see, they're filling it in. Bill Kunkel, Charlene Komar, Chris Couch, John D. Barry when he was in New York. I don't know if it was too often. He's gone already. He couldn't stand this for more than about 15 minutes and he left. He always claims he has something else to do, you know. He's very polite that way. But a lot of fanzines came out of that group, and in fact, Arnie, if you ever have read any of his pieces about numbered fan history, and the whole concept of a focal point for fanzines and for the fandom, he considers that period of his life in Brooklyn as being the center of all fan activity of importance in that period. So,
Well, he was doing things with a lot of people, including Rich Brown.
oh yeah,
Things like Focal Point and Quip.
they
And
did Focal Point for a year as a news zine in 1970, and then a couple of years later, Arnie revived it, but as a gen zine.
actually, they revived it 3 times, I think, 2 or 3 times.
Well, at
But-
least once.
Yeah, he did and you know, he was doing everything from one pagers like Wooden Nickel to many others. I'll take this to toot our horn. We're about to put up a whole lot of Arnie's fanzines. He just gave us permission.
Oh, great, great.
Good.
I mean, the energy those guys had, I mean, Arnie and Joyce specifically, but everybody in their circle, Arnie was very good at getting, you know, production out of people. Ross Chamberlain, a guy gave him a ton of stuff.
Sure
but many
did.
other,
Great
many-
stuff.
yeah, great stuff. And many other people, you know, wrote for him as well. And the quality of the zines is really quite good. And they deserve to be remembered. I was very happy to get them.
He and Joyce did the same thing after they had moved to Las Vegas, and when they got interested in fandom again, they got everyone around them interested.
Yeah, they were very good at that. They did the same thing with wrestling, after all.
Well, what are some of the other people who were doing fanzines in New York in that period? Lois, you were doing fanzines.
Deborah,
We
Well,
published
talk about yourself and your zine
That's
and
the
your
front
co-editor.
well, that was also Deborah, I think.
we published a few issues of
Deborah
Placebo,
did most of the good
and
fanzines in New York.
Joyce Yasner.
Joyce
also?
Yasner, yeah, and Debbie, her cousin, when she was around. Debbie,
Frank,
Langsom,
Debbie Langsom,
yeah.
Frank Dietz was publishing Luna Monthly.
but
Right.
that was in, well, he was in Oradell. He
Well,
worked in New York. He worked
that
in,
counts as the metropolitan area.
he worked as a repairman for Western Union and like West 38th or 39th Street. And I would bring my copy into him, and they'd take it out and they'd do the typesetting, turning into stuff for what I was doing as a chronic.
He also, as I found when I was looking at photos in the Eaton collection, he was also running a tape recorder at a number of Worldcons and I guess other conventions, recording all the program items. And I kind of wonder whatever happened to those tapes.
I tracked down the remnants. I have a couple of material pieces from it, but his ex-wife said that they pretty much threw them out. They went bad.
They were done on 35 millimeter film canisters. They was enormous, like 3-foot wide film canisters. So he was able to record things for hours and hours at a time.
Oh,
I believe what happened to a lot of that stuff was the sound would bleed through. And
It
you
did.
the cacophony, and then you couldn't hear anything.
I mean, magnetic tape
I
is an
know.
apparently very delicate medium, actually. It's not really meant for long-term storage. The magnetic particles and the backing of the tape start to separate, and the magnetic stuff flakes off, and you lose what you've recorded. And
that's bad.
you know, the only way to preserve that is to transfer it to something else that's got more durability. And I don't think people were really conscious of it at the time. You know, it took a while from the post-war period when magnetic tape was invented to replace wire recording, you know, before it became widespread. And, I don't think people realized in the first 10, 20 years that the stuff was never going to last, you know, for a lifetime. Probably 20
I don't
years.
think they had the materials or the technology.
I
Yeah,
had
create anything better.
I had tapes from Nikon 3, which I eventually gave to the Science Fiction Oral History Association, which was what Lloyd Biggle and other people out in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And I have no idea what happened to that, because that's I think some of that material from them might have gone up to Joe Siclari. I don't know, Joe?
Some of it did.
If I might. My understanding is that the quality of the tape could vary from batch to batch. And sometimes you got lucky and hit a batch that would last a long time. For example, I was delighted to discover that interviews that I had done on WKCR at Columbia in the early 1960s were still audible 40 or so years later. And I took them to Vermont Public Radio, had them copied on to CDs, and sent them off to Joe, and also some other tapes which I'd sent to Joe. I don't know what was remained on them.
Fred, some of those we have online already.
Yeah, the ones that were on the DVD or CDs rather.
Yeah, there's a lot of variability here. I mean, not only with the batch one kind of tape, but there were different grades of tape. There was cheap tape and there was expensive tape. Expensive tape, you know, would last longer, and also there's a question of the way it's kept. You know, it's much better, you know, in one position rather than another, so the reel doesn't get warped, for example. And then temperature and humidity matter a lot as well. If it's too hot, the tape can end up sticking together, and then it's impossible to deal with it. So there's a lot of luck involved. But really, it just isn't a medium that ever had a chance to be, you know, archival in the long run. And we're lucky that what survived, I suspect.
I had commercial tapes done for the 78 Worldcon in Phoenix, and I gave those. They were in this packaging, plastic packaging, and I gave those to Joe. And I'm not sure what's happened to those, Joe. You have those now.
We have everything you gave us, Andy. We haven't been able to, we have almost too much stuff. We constantly going through it, trying to process some and get some online.
Better you than me, sir. Hey, Diane Drakowski, I haven't seen you since the 76 autoclave. How are you doing?
Anyway, why don't we take some questions from the audience at this point?
That's a reasonable thing at this point in time. Edie, can you open it up to everyone?
Nope. What I'm going to do is, if you've got a question, please put your name in the chat, and then let's unmute in order one at a time so that we don't all talk over each other.
That's a good idea.
If no one's got questions, we'll make them up. Go ahead, John. John's got something. Go ahead and unmute.
Another person who was a link between the New York University group and the other groups was Dee Potter, who was quite crazy and quite wonderful.
Yeah,
Yes, she
One of the
was.
very few black fans.
Called
Another
herself Tall
tall
Black
fan.
Woman with One Blonde Shoe.
Shoot,
Yeah.
yes.
actually, we should mention Gary Tesser as another person who
Oh,
was
yeah.
in a number of different groups and a unique personality, who we're sorry is no longer with us, and kind of a legendary figure in many ways. Yeah, it's kind of amazing to me how many people have not survived into this far into the 21st century. And it's really kind of sad. There are people I thought would still be around who are gone. But
Yes.
John, I've never seen your mom's house before. That's where are you in the house?
I'm in the master bedroom, which was hers.
Aha. Okay.
I'm in a corner of it.
So what do you want to say about Gary Tesser?
I could say a thing about Gary Tesser,
Okay.
that we never had to explain a joke to him more than once. In the early days, we had to explain jokes to him. He didn't understand, but he was not stupid. He picked it up, and he picked it up really fast.
He now sounds like he might have been on the spectrum.
Yeah.
That is conceivable.
Many of us are on the
Yeah.
spectrum, I think.
Gary did have a problem with getting to places on time.
Yeah, Tesser-time was, yes, it was a thing.
We have to be fair to Gary and point out that he worked for the post office as a letter carrier. So he had very long hours starting early in the morning.
Ah,
And it wasn't unusual for him to, nod off at a meeting because he was just so tired. And he didn't want to miss what was going on. He just couldn't help it. So that definitely was a factor in a lot of this. But it's also true that he had his own cockeyed view of reality that, it took a while to adjust to. But he also had a great sense of humor, and there's no doubt about his intelligence in terms of his his reading comprehension or whatever you want to say. In fact, he was as important in Robert's Rules of Order fandom as he was in our, or maybe more important in Robert's Rules of Order fandom than he was in our fandom. And that certainly was not, for the faint of heart as far as intellectual stuff was concerned. He knew all those rules backwards and forwards, and had strong opinions about any changes that were going to be made.
now I'm imagining him being the parliamentarian at a Worldcon business meeting.
He totally could have. Yeah. Oh, Dave Emerson has a question for me.
Yeah, hi. Speaking of Gary Tesser, I remember another group that he and I were in. Whatever happened to the Omnivores?
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Well, another one of my fannish projects. When I stopped keeping kosher, I wanted to explore the cuisines of the world as they were represented in New York. So we started having monthly food expeditions to go to a different kind of restaurant each time so that I could try different kinds of food. And I don't remember how long we did it for, but basically we ran through, all the major cuisines, and then, we didn't really need to keep it up at that point, I guess. Oh, you have a cat with you also. I have my cat in my.
Yeah. Well, I remember going on a few of those expeditions, including one to a German restaurant in Yorktown, I think.
Yes, that was a great one.
Heidelberg.
Yeah.
And that was the one where I drank so much of the excellent German beer that I overcame my shyness and kind of tipped Susan Palermo over and kissed her. And she took it well, I have to say. I mean, now we would call that, completely unacceptable. But at the time, I got away with it. And unfortunately, that restaurant isn't there anymore. I think Yorkville is down to its last few, maybe 2 or 3 German places. It's no longer the center of a German population the way it used to be. But there's still a couple of good ones up there. Next time you're in town.
Yeah. I I remember very fondly some of those food expeditions, and I think that started not long before I left New York. And so I was just wondering how long it continued after that.
Yeah, my memory does not retain that kind of detail. So maybe Hank Davis could probably tell us. Hank Davis is my external hard drive, so to speak. He often remembers parts of my life better than I did, and I bet he could tell me, what the last Omnivores was and how long it went on for. I mean, it was at least a few years worth, I think, but I can't tell you exactly.
I think it might have gone on as long as I lived in New York. And although Susan remembers, and I don't, but Susan remembers one Omnivores where we came outside after having a meal, and a Lubavitcher.
No,
Sorry.
other way around. We were outside a restaurant waiting to get
Okay.
in, a whole bunch of us, because they had to seat us. There was a whole group of people.
You lost?
No, it
Lost
was
your-
my fault. I was trying to spotlight her and I muted her by mistake.
Oh,
Okay,
Suzanne,
okay.
Please.
Is that
please.
okay? I thought I knew it was a group, and the Lubovichers were working their way down this group, and they saw this whole group of us, and they came up to us, and they looked at Andy Porter, and they said their usual thing, "Are you Jewish?" And he looked down and said, "No," because none of us wanted to get involved with these people at the time, and that was a fun. The other memory, Jerry, we went to a delicatessen. I think it was in the village, but I just don't remember. And it had a lot of very authentic and interesting food. And we both decided to order, it was a ground meat dish.
yes, with a lot
It
of
was
garlic.
very garlicky. And they warned us, and they said, but we were used to, hot garlic, and various things. So,
Oh,
this is fine. Oh, it wasn't fine. Both
It
of
was
us
like-
smelled like garlic for days afterwards.
Yeah,
They
people
complained
shied
very
away from me at
often.
work the next day. I don't remember, but also here's another thing that I wanted to bring up, which was that even if Moshe wasn't able to come along one month for some reason, it wasn't an Omnivores. It was only an Omnivores if Moshe was part of the group. And so I started a group called Gastronomes, which was that whenever we went out, we were a Gastronomes, unless Moshe was with us.
Right. So he created a group that by definition I couldn't be a member of, which I really resented.
Yes, I know, it drove me crazy.
It was I thought it was funny too, but
Yes, well, I thought it was funny, which is why I did it, but he
We
was
had
always,
a
would
question.
never refuse to go on a out with Moshe. It was just, if he was along, it wasn't that particular group.
the other thing that distinguishes the 70s from the later decades in New York fandom, all the way through to the point where FANAC finally petered out, was just that we were all at a point in our lives when we had the free time to do this stuff. Go out to dinner, go to conventions, hang out at club meetings. And you can only do that when you're like, relatively early in your career or your marriage and you don't have a family to take care of yet.
Or you're retired, as we
Or
are
you're
now.
retired, yeah. And then later on, when I got a publishing job finally, it got really hard to just keep doing that stuff because publishing requires lots of homework. And everybody else got busy with their careers also, I guess, because this had fewer and fewer people showing up.
Or we moved.
Or you moved out of town, yeah.
When I moved out of town, everybody I knew became an editor.
What was it about Seattle that magnetically attracted so many people from New York fandom to go there?
Well, okay, I went and visited, I in the summer of '76, I went to a WesternCon in LA. I went up to the Bay Area, stayed with, at least part of the time with Charlie and Dina, and visited people in the city. And then I went up to Seattle and visited Lauren and John Barry, and I met Paul Nowitzki, who was still publishing stuff, fanzine stuff under the name Alpashbury. And Seattle, and the Seattle fans that I met seemed to be the most congenial. The city was a nice scale. when the bus failed to come on the morning that I had to get to the airport, Metro, the bus service, sent a little jitney and picked up people and took them where they had to go. And I was impressed by that. I couldn't imagine that happening in New York. So the following year, when I decided to move, and I talked to Susan, she decided to move with me. We did Seattle. Seemed reasonable. We lived with Lauren McGregor and another guy named Jeff Frayne for a few months, and then set ourselves up in business, as it were. After that, I can't speak for other people, but certainly after us, a lot of people did move in, even if only for a couple of years, and then out again.
Linda, I'm sorry, were you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, Linda, you've got your hand up?
I moved to Seattle. I didn't know, I knew there were a couple of New Yorkers living in Seattle, but I had friends from other places who were living there, and I had broken my foot, and I found my support was coming from my Seattle friends more than my New York friends. So I went out for a visit and got a job right away and moved out there. But it was, Seattle was kind of like a small version of New York. The weather was a lot better with milder summers and milder winters. And I said, I'm going to give it 10 years. If I don't like it, I'll move back to New York. And I knew within 2 I was moving.
Yeah, you're still there, right? So.
Yeah. Well, right now I'm in Florida, but that's a different story.
Okay. Well, I like your backdrop, which makes you look like you're in outer space. So that's pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay, we've had a question. Go back to New York. Can you guys tell us about, there was some concentrations of fandom up in Washington Heights and Broadway Terrace. Who were some of the people there? Why did everybody seem to join there?
Affordable rent. That's what it comes down to. So Stu Schiffman was there. Patrick and Teresa were there. Dee Potter was there, I think, right? Bill Wagner.
Was certainly, I think that might have been more in the 80s, though.
Yeah.
Those were somewhat in the 80s, yes, late 70s. You and I moved into the Cinemansion in 76, was it?
Well, we were there for a year, and then I was with Stu for a year after you moved out.
Yeah,
and then somebody else moved in after you moved out.
So yeah, Jonathan
Adams.
Oh, wow.
And then Susan was 2 blocks away. She moved in after we did. John Douglas and Ginger Buchanan and Jeannie DeMonica all lived a little bit north of us, but they had been living there before we moved into that neighborhood. And then Hank and Ross, I think, moved into the Susan's building sometime in 76 or 77.
Yeah.
Side note, one of the worst moves we've ever been involved with. They were moving from the apartment, which had been Ted White's apartment, where Ross was living and Hank, in Brooklyn. Brooklyn? That sounds wrong.
Yeah,
That's what it was. It was
Wrong. I was like, anyway,
49th
we lived, of course, Broadway,
They were in the Bronx
Washington Heights.
also.
We were north. We were at 181st Street, and they moved. It was like 105 degrees out. Well, not really, but close.
it was.
And they
very
were
hot.
moving in a pickup truck, one load at a time. While those of us trying to help them move, my apartment was in the building and I had an air conditioner in the bedroom. I was selling a first aid station for people who were about to pass out from the heat. It went on all weekend. On Monday morning, I left to go to work, and they're pulling up with another load. So I remember that move very, very well. And I don't think I saw them much after that. After that, I lived down in Stu and Jonathan's apartment the last month I was in New York before I moved, because my lease was up. And
I'm sorry. I was just
Brian
going to say,
was there. Ted Greenstone was there. Greenstone, right? John Stone is in California. He's get them mixed up.
does anybody have anything else for Andy? Because unfortunately, I have to kick him out in a few minutes.
I wanted to say something. I wanted to say there was Edie asked me about, you heard from Ted White about the 67 Worldcon, and he said, do you have any after effects? Well, you don't understand, back then, the committee, the people who did all the thing were like about literally a handful of people, like 5 or 6 people on the committee. And there was no other involvement of anyone in fandom. And what happened after the convention was Ted White eventually, several years later, moved to Virginia. Dave Van Erner moved to Mexico. Rich Brown moved to, I think, Virginia. Mike McInerney eventually moved to San Francisco, where he's still active in a little bit way. He's on a couple of groups and stuff. But it was like, and Lee Hoffman, I think, moved to Florida, but it was a very small committee. It was I think the entire convention grossed about $35,000. That was it. The attending membership was $3. And the years when conventions grossed hundreds of thousands of dollars and have a vast committee, that came much later. So there wasn't that much effect on fandom in New York after Nikon, except I think it grew even more fractured. Also, all the pros back in the 60s who were in New York, Robert Silverberg and Robert Sheckley and all sorts of other people, Terry Carr, everyone moved out, mostly to California.
Mm-hmm.
That altered things too.
So do you know of any fans who got into fandom because they attended that Worldcon?
No, well, I was on the inside. I was working on the convention. So pretty much, I kind of missed it. So I had no idea.
Okay.
Andy, how many people attended Nikon 3?
1,500.
Okay.
And that was the one where we didn't know, but they were in the process of automating the elevators. And so it was horrible elevator service. And then there was the infamous thing at the banquet where Sam Moskowitz went on and on and on and on and on about the first Fandom Award. And then Lester Del Rey had to cut short his guest of honor speech. It was really, and that was a result in Sam Moskowitz being never allowed again to speak at a Worldcon convention, a banquet or anything. And then pretty much after that, no more banquets. Boom.
And at the costume competition or masquerade ball, whatever we were calling it that year,
Yes.
there were somewhere close to 10 people dressed as Spock, plus at least one group that dressed as the whole crew, if I remember correctly. And that's part of the reason, Susan and I joined with Linda Bush Yeager and Bill Millardy to write our only folk song, which to the tune of Yesterday was about the Nikon. So
the benefit of Star Trek fans who are watching, there's a newly discovered, I think, videotape of Leonard Nimoy talking about how television shows are produced, and it just showed up on YouTube. So it's something you might want to go look for.
yes. Well, that sounds interesting.
Okay, so I've got another question. There has been no New York Worldcons, but effectively the SunCon, about 10 years later, exactly 10 years later, was effectively a New York Worldcon that was carpetbagged, New York, New Jersey Worldcon that was carpetbagged into Florida. I know
Landry.
none of you
John
guys
Landry
really
from-
worked on that.
John Landry from New Jersey, the Philadelphia area, and a lot of others. And it was originally, I believe, 7 for 77. And then I had a bid. I was working on a bid for Montreal, and that died. And
some of us did work on 7 for 77.
Yeah, I was on the committee.
Well, some of the people in the audience, yes, but not on
Sorry.
the panel.
no.
Yep.
And of
And,
course, the hotel went bankrupt. It was an Orlando hotel, and it wanted to renegotiate the contract, and they said, "Screw you."
I'm pretty sure I was at some committee meetings.
They moved to the Fontainebleau in Miami Beach.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. And that's where the controversy started.
Ooh,
Well, part of the controversy started. But the reason I brought it up is that there was a question in the chat. That's probably more for another time. I was much too heavily involved in that one. I got to not see my first PhilCon because of that meetings for that convention. Anyway, the things that were going on. Did we have any other questions in the chat, Edie?
I saw Richard Dengrove wanted to know what Hank Davis and Gary Tesser were like at the time that we were in New York. So if anybody has a
Well,
I think we've already covered Gary pretty well.
Is there anything else for Andy before we lose him?
Nope.
Yes, actually, I'm gonna kill Steve now. So
Steve, thank you for hosting him.
Thank you.
bye.
Hank,
Andy.
Everyone.
Bye, Andy.
Lisa.
Okay,
Aloha,
bye, Andy.
sayonara.
Bye, Steve. Are you signing off too?
Yes.
Well,
What?
I'll be monitoring in the background.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, it was great
Alrighty.
to hang out with you this way.
sure.
We hadn't
Sure.
met
All
before.
right. Let me go launch him into space.
It's been fun.
Okay, you're gonna throw him out the airlock, huh?
No. He's gonna put me out the door, and I'm gonna take the elevator down and to the.
You want to give him a reason to be spaceman, huh?
Yeah, cold equations. Judd, there are no more questions.
Okay,
Okay.
well, everyone, we're going to stop the video.
Thank you.
And
First
then
of
we
all,
can get
all
into
of
the
you,
really
including the
scurrilous
moderator,
gossip.
Yes,
including the
thank you
moderator.
all.